guys, thank you so much for joining me in another video. So as you can tell based on the title, I thought today we would talk about the Row. I thought we would talk about their latest collection, pre-fall 2024, as well as this connection to American minimalism. Now, when it comes to minimal fashion, I think it is often something that is perceived as very Steve Jobs, tech bro aesthetic. Think like Silicon Valley turtlenecks with Levi's jeans and New Balance. Steve Jobs wore Issey Miyake tops. The attitude is you have too many important decisions to make that you can't be bothered with the frivolity of fashion. When you think about Mark Zuckerberg and this kind of like tech bro style, what I find so interesting when I talk to a lot of people that love the Row, Jill Sander, etc., there's actually so much obsession these women have with having the perfect cut, having the most optimal materials. Like talking the other day to somebody about their obsession with lightweight materials. When I think of somebody like Tawny Goodman, her style is so focused around her lifestyle as someone who's a Vogue editor who travels a lot, and everything is very meaningful and personal to her, but it's so heavily curated. When you look at minimalism as a fashion style, there are actually regional styles, regional differences. When I think about like Scandi style or Japanese minimalist fashion to even French minimal fashion, think of a brand like APC. And then there are also brands like La Mer, where this is a French brand, but the impact of Sarah Lynn Tran gives it more of this beautiful East-West fusion, right? But in today's video, I really want to focus on American minimalism. This is heavily rooted in New York, but there are a lot of themes around it that feel very American. With this, we'll look at the Row's latest collection and how it really represents the ideas as well as the ideals of American minimalism. But at the same time, we'll talk about how the Row is actually doing something a little bit different than a lot of their American predecessors. So I recently did a video where I talked about minimalist brands in the 1980s, and I really talked a lot about American sportswear. So I don't really want to rehash a lot of things I stated there, as well as I did a video on 90s minimalism. So if you haven't checked out those videos, a lot of those points still stand true here, but I really want to focus today on American minimalism. So let's look at the Row. Let's look at previous American designers that I think helped pave the way for the Row, but we'll also talk about what they're doing very differently in 2023. One very important starting point that we could talk about all the fashion designers, which we will, but I really have to talk about American minimalism in art. And I think this connection with the art world. When we talk about minimalism from an art making perspective, many of these themes could easily be translated to design, architecture, furniture. If you look at the Row's Instagram, they often post art, design, furniture, and their sort of aesthetic. I do think there are some notable differences where American minimalism deviates from European minimalism. And I know there are a lot of people that probably already know all this, but there are probably people that don't. When we look at American minimalism, it is important to point out in the 1960s, the American minimalists were very much influenced by a very post-World War II climate, and it was actually during a period where it was very economically prosperous. Versus the European context, Europe was recovering from the devastation of World War II, and as a result, they were more politically and socially engaged in their work. And American minimalist pioneer Donald Judd stated, "It isn't necessary for a work to have a lot of things to look at, to compare, to analyze one by one, to contemplate. The thing as a whole, its quality whole, is what is interesting. The main things are alone and more intense, clear and powerful." Another notable point is American minimalism favored neutrals and subdued muted palettes. It was because there was often an emphasis on form, structure, and space. And I think that's kind of the key point, form over color. Now, what's so interesting in this collection is we're seeing more color than ever, probably more so than a lot of other collections that we're used to, but still the emphasis for the Row is form and silhouette over color. And you know, this is obviously not true of everyone, right? Like there's some American minimalist designers that embrace color, like I think about how HALSTON embraced the color red, right? But it exposed the beauty of his forms versus when we look at a lot of European paintings, works, color is very much used as an essential element in overall compositions. And when we just look at the differences between Phoebe Philo's Celine to Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen's The Row, right? Phoebe Philo was someone that used color and she would use it to make a point versus The Row, the focus was on more muted color palettes. And of course, there's exceptions here and there. I'm just speaking broadly, right? Another point I want to make is there doesn't have to be an absolute meaning when it comes to minimalist art. For some works, there might be, but it's not like a portrait, monument, or or representation, or say when we speak about the row, a piece of clothing with a specific association. It can have multiple associations. And when I think of American artist Tony Smith's 1962 sculpture Die, it's this 6-foot sculpture with human proportions that doesn't come across as anything aesthetically appealing, but the simple title conjures multiple associations. Is it one pair of dice, the singularity of that object, 6-foot box, death? The meaning becomes relative, and the same can be said about the row. None of these garments are absolutely centered around a theme, period, or they don't have this overt symbolism, versus when I think of, say, like an Eddie Slimane Celine, there might be a theme of late 60s Parisian style and a specific collection, and there's this kind of this attitude that the clothing expresses. The row intentionally rejects this, and as a result, it really invites the wearer to adapt their own meanings to that piece. And another point I also want to emphasize here is how American minimalism was heavily centered in New York. New York was really the epicenter, and this is where Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen are located. This is a founding style that exists in New York, and of course there's abstract expressionism, but in Europe, in contrast, there were these pockets of movements, whether we think of, I recently talked about Arte Povera, Nouveau Realism, and the Zero Group, other movements in different pockets in Europe. I think going back to New York, being the center of American commerce, it is one of the more opportunistic places to become an artist versus Europe in the 1960s, which was rebuilding itself. And for the works of Sol LeWitt, he's very well known for his open-air modular structures. He once stated, quote, "The most interesting characteristic of the cube is that it is relatively uninteresting. Yet you can pretty much go to any modern art museum and you see his work. How is this work that is so uninteresting interesting?" I think this statement speaks to not only what minimalist artists often aim to achieve, but I think what the row offers and aims for in this collection. These objects like cubes or these ordinary minimalist garments lack really any meaning, but there is also this starkness at the same time. And I just also want to say this, I'm not saying this is something most people will find attractive. If anything, most people actually find minimal clothing, minimal art not very appealing at all. Like a lot of people I know in my personal life, like people in my family, they're always like, why do you like that? And I'm not trying to like make you see something that isn't there. And at the end of the day, we all have our own individual connections. This is just me trying to explain this thinking. And I think the best way to explain it is through making this comparison with these American minimalist artists. And you know, with all this being said here, European art has like a huge influence on the row, and that is not to like take away from this. You can literally check out any of my videos talking about this. But I do think when we look at the history of American minimalism, growing at a time of prosperity in America, this preference of form over color, sure, we're having rare moments of color with this collection, but there's still an emphasis on form. So just notable things like that. But now let's talk about American minimalism and fashion. And the inspiration for this video actually came about when I was doing a video where I read the review in Vogue on the brand Forum, and Paul Helbers, the creative director, actually was talking about the influence of the American designers before him. I'll read this quote again. "I feel the hunger in New York for the level of clothes, the precision, the ease, the combination, the craftsmanship. I think it goes back to the things that happened before in New York, like HALSTON, Jeffrey Bean, Zoran," said Helbers, and I think we're bringing that back. So yeah, I thought we'd talk about some of these designers and how we kind of see the row in a lot of these works here. Again, I don't want to repeat a lot of the points that I made in the 80s and 90s. Of course, we have Donna Karan, Calvin Klein, like the American sportswear designers of those periods. Goes without saying at this point, but I thought we'd kind of talk a little bit about these other designers that we haven't really emphasized. When we talk about the designer Jeffrey Bean, he was really a designer that challenged the American fashion establishment by creating couture that was rooted in tailoring but emphasized comfort, and you still felt that luxury quality. He was very interested in architectural simplicity and technique. With a lot of his work, there's this attention to detail, precise tailoring. He was very interested in using innovative sewing techniques and fabric manipulations. And I think this concept of the emphasis of comfort and luxury is definitely at the center of the row. In the 1960s and 70s, this modernist sensibility of favoring clean lines and precision is really felt. Another designer that I've talked about many times on my channel, but we have to talk about it again if we're talking about American fashion. And while I think HALSTON is known for many other things other than minimalism, it is hard to deny the modern minimalist aesthetic that was very prevalent in his work. His designs feature those clean lines, that simplicity, that effortless sense of style. He would favor monochromatic color palettes to emphasize the luxurious materials, but I don't want to limit him to his minimal designs. He was known for the pillbox hat, ultra suede, and just that like disco culture style. Another designer that I want to talk about, while it's not very obvious that he's a minimalist, again, I don't really think this term was heavily used. This aesthetic wasn't really thoroughly thought out and noticeable as it is today, but I really want to talk about the works by Scott Barry. Now, he was very heavily inspired by French designer Madame Grès and her very beautifully draped gowns in the 1930s. Scott Barry was very interested in experimental draping. I can definitely see like a Norma Kamali being influenced, and I wouldn't say his work is at the core minimalist, but I think this interest in draping would be a place of inspiration for many sportswear designers. Next, we're going to talk about Zoran, who was a designer who studied under Scott Barry. He was actually an accessories designer, but Zoran was known for his very extreme minimalism. He followed those American sportswear principles, neutral colors, maybe a color here and there, but again, the use of very high quality premium silks, cashmere, the quality materials was definitely felt. And I talked about him in my video on the 1980s. Women to this day still rave about his work, and apparently he's a designer that he works on like a private basis for individual clients. He's truly an if you know designer. And when we look at this recent collection from the row, the sportswear, the casualness, we saw a continuation from their previous collection, spring summer 2024. We had these moments of sportswear, and we're really continuing on this sporty aesthetic, these sporty jackets, some worn with pleated pants. There's this extreme relaxation with these towels, these hotel room slippers, so casual. What was very interesting with the last collection, we kind of talked about normcore and dadcore, kind of talked about how some of the looks look like dads at Best Buy or something. I don't know, that was the vibe I got. But to me, this collection, they're not your dad at Best Buy. This isn't going to a baseball game vibe. This is someone going for their hotel breakfast or something, going to grab their newspaper. That's the vibe of this. One very important point to talk about is this interest in color. What's so interesting is when the row does something like they add color, like it is so noticed, you can tell there's more interest with this like vivid blue. We're still seeing this vermilion red, but again, the emphasis of these pieces is not the color. We're still seeing a heavy emphasis on the shape of like this blue sculptural top and how it just stands out. And it stands out even more because of this color. If this was in black, it wouldn't stand out as much, but because it's in blue, we're seeing the shadows and the texture, and it's actually very intriguing to look at. Another thing that we are seeing as a continuation is this theme of lightness, these light fabrics, these mesh shoes, and these shoes look so modern and forward looking. And the row have done this before, see-through shoes. They've been doing this before. The trend has kind of caught up recently. We're seeing a continuation with this, and of course the hotel slippers, but at the same time we're also seeing a continuation of monochromatic looks, all black, jersey, dresses worn with pants, just your classic quintessential the row pieces. And when we talk about accessories, they are continuing on with the Margot bag, which they've been continuing on for several seasons due to its success. We're seeing this kind of interesting, I don't know if it's like a tote, it's got these like metal details, very interesting. Pillow clutches, looks like super soft and buttery. I thought this caged, almost basket looking bag was quite interesting. This collection is very much a continuation of what the row has been doing. What I do think sets the row apart from a lot of these other brands, I've stated this before, while a lot of these American brands, they are subject to the market, they are subject to their corporate interests, they're subject to being a part of these larger corporations or whoever's financing them, right? Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen, they don't need to do this. They're sitting atop their billion-dollar empire they built when they were children. Now they can just do whatever they want. So this is them just fully creating fashion just of their own desires. There is no trying to follow the winds of the market. Now the market has met the row, but even if its sales don't meet last quarter's expectations, it's okay because they don't need to up their quarterly earnings every year. Like they can just do what they want. And I think there's a lot of freedom in that when we look at the LVMHs, the Kerings. A lot of these brands are struggling right now to hit their quarterly earnings, right? To exceed what their profits were last year. The row doesn't have that problem. A lot of these American brands, even just these other minimalist brands, when you look at a Jill Sander, they struggled when they were part of Prada group, right? That's like a huge appeal for this brand. And it's definitely felt that desire to make something that is them, that is 100% them. During the era of Logomania, they were still doing this. They're going to do this now. They're going to do this when it swings back to Logomania or Maximalism. And they'll be fine because they're not accountable to anyone but themselves. That's my video. Thank you so much for joining me in another one, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.